Hello, hello, and welcome to this festive fun live stream celebrating Krampus. For today is Krampusnacht, December 5th. um, I don't, sadly, as I was preparing, I realized I actually don't have a Krampus shirt of any kind. But what I do have is a Squatching Through the Snow shirt. I feel like Bigfoot and Krampus are kind of related. I know there's some B movies, if not C movies, that are actually about Krampus meeting Sasquatch. So this was as close as I could get, and I hope you appreciate it. So, welcome. Thank you all so very much for being here. Um, I don't often do live streams, so forgive me if I'm a little bit awkward. But I would love for this to be a little bit more of a discussion and a conversation than necessarily me just talking at you. So the chat's always available. I'm gesturing to my computer monitor and I'm looking to the side. Should look at the camera. The chat is always available. So please send in your comments and your questions, and I will do my best to answer them. So for anyone who's new here or doesn't know me, my name is Kellie. I am an author who publishes under my initials, K.M. Rice. And while I am primarily a fiction author, I also have written in the realm of nonfiction and research, most notably in a massive book called Middle Earth from Script to Screen, Building the World of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. So if you are a fan of those films or of J.R.R. Tolkien in general, you may have heard of this book. It's really big. And I was honored to do some research and additional writing in that book. But also, I have studied literature quite extensively. I have a Bachelor of Arts in English, which includes a lot of literature. I have a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing, which at the university I attended required half of your course load needed to be in-depth literature courses. So I feel quite secure and cozy, I dare say, in the world of books. And as I started on this path of exploring the origins of extant holidays, I found that there weren't a huge pile of reliable resources when you're looking at things that date back to prehistory. So by prehistory, I mean before the written record. It's really difficult to draw certain conclusions. And so that led me to doing extensive research on my own part down these paths of knowledge, trying to garner whatever I could from folklorists, from historians, from archaeologists to see what actually is documented, what actually is out there. So everything I'm going to share with you today about Krampus is either documented, or I will make sure that I couch what I say with the parameters that, well, this is a theory. Because sadly, there's a lot we just won't ever know. But through all of this extensive research, I have discovered that there's a lot of folks out there, especially in the neo-pagan, New Age communities, who have written extensively about these types of subjects, about, let's call them pre-Christian customs. And those folks, some of those folks are writing more from a point of view of like their perspective and their thoughts with very little informed research. And I have found that in pop culture, a lot of those ideas take root and take hold and take on a life of their own. And that's fine. But me being the way I am, and, a sort of little nerd academic at the corner, I'm like, well, that's cool, but is that real? Like, did people really talk about that? Is that really a thing? Or is this just conjecture? If it's conjecture, let's just present it as such. So that's been my goal. And that's led me down a path that I never saw coming of being an educator. So not only do I do virtual events like this, even though this is I think this might be my first live stream delving into folklore, but I also have a podcast and I do in-person events, mostly locally, where I impart what I've learned to a crowd, and we usually then gather and do a traditional craft and taste traditional food around whatever the holiday is, largely revolving around the wheel of the year. And also that's led me to trying to consolidate this information again in an accessible way with as much context as possible and offer that as online courses. So you can find those at my website, which is my pen name, kmrice.com. There's a section there called offerings. I've pinned a link here in the chat. That link is to purchase a course that is currently available right now. In fact, at the lowest price I've ever offered it. That's called Yuletide, Keeping Old Christmas. But what I'm putting into the chat right now is a page where you can learn a little bit more about it. But so this live stream is like a taste of what that course offers. So that course provides its information in both written form as downloadable PDFs. This is actually a really bad example. The PDFs are really beautifully crafted. They've got a lot of images and artwork, but also as audio content, because people learn in different ways, and I'm happy to cater to different educational styles. Okay, so that's a little bit about me and who I am. If anyone wants to introduce themselves in the chat, please feel welcome. So we have David Francis here. David, I know you from our Tolkien fandom. And David saying, I watched The Rings of Power season 2 and it was very good and made me happy to see it. Oh, that's great. So there we go. We've got some more crossover with the Tolkien fandom. Everywhere I go, I tend to bring Tolkien with me and bring some of my fellow community members from that world with me. And I do find that there's a lot of crossover between people who love Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings and people who are fascinated with mythology and folklore, which makes total sense because the professor himself was an avid student of folklore and of mythology. I do not know if Tolkien was aware of Krampus. He more than likely was, because Krampusnacht celebrations were going on in his time. But to my knowledge, he has never written about it. But what is Krampus, or who? And what is Krampusnacht? Well, in many German regions, Saint Nicholas, or Sinterklaas in the Netherlands, comes on December 6th. So the feast day for Saint Nicholas is December 6th. And that's the day that children would get a visit from the saint. And he would often look like a saint from a bygone era. His costume was often that of like I think a bishop. He had the hat and the garb of a bishop. He would often arrive on a white horse, and he usually had a helper or two. And in some traditions, he would be coming to see if the children knew their prayers. That's sometimes conflated with or in lieu of asking the children or their parents if the children have been good. And someone says, Woland, happy St. Nicholas Eve. Thank you. And to you, St. Nicholas Eve is also known as Krampusnacht in certain alpine regions. So as St. Nicholas would be making his way, or Sinterklaas would be making his way through the village and visiting homes, he had an accomplice. And there's several different accomplices that would be coming with him. And it was sort of a good cop, bad cop routine. Except that in most of the books that I've read, it seems that St. Nicholas himself was quite removed from all of the proceedings. He would let his henchmen, the dark side of St. Nicholas, folks like Krampus, scare the kids, mete out their punishments, do their spooky things, and he'd just sort of stand there aloof and reserved and removed instead of intervening on the children's behalf. Not a blanket rule, but often that was the role that St. Nicholas played. So St. Nicholas would usually be a member of the community in costume. This is a tradition that dates back as far as we can really imagine for humankind, the concept of pantomime, of putting on a costume or changing your appearance in some way and becoming other. So it was understood that once that person was in this disguise, they were someone else. So even if you could recognize, like, oh, that's Klaus's uncle. Not right now. Right then, he wasn't Klaus's uncle. Going on a tangent here, but I feel like we still have this alive and well in our culture. Because if you go to a play, a live performance really of any kind, and you can see someone up on stage who you know and love very well. But while they're up on stage, they're someone else. And they're in a different realm. And they might like walk into the audience in a theatrical production. They might walk right past you. But you can't interact with them in the same way that you normally would. It's like they create a spell. The whole situation and atmosphere creates a spell. I find that really fascinating. So it was the same concept with St. Nicholas going into homes and arriving in the village, and his sidekick, be it Krampus, Black Pete, Belsnickel, Next Ruprecht. They were all there to be the enforcer of St. Nicholas, really the enforcer for the parents. So Krampus is, oh, Maria. Oh, I'm going to butcher your name. Devaranu says early cosplay. Yeah, exactly. Except most cosplayers I know don't truly cosplay. They just put on the outfit and they're still them. I do remember the days of early cosplay where that meant like the person was pretending to be in character the whole time. That was cool. But Krampus, by most accounts, is described as a satyr-like figure. So he would walk on two legs and have cloven feet, like hooves, rather like a goat, big horns, beastly features, a very distinct, long, lolling red tongue, just to really accentuate his grotesqueness. He was a hulking, beastly figure with chains and bells and a sack and a switch. And he'd lumber out of the forest with St. Nicholas. And it must have been quite terrifying to have been a young person who didn't know that that was Klaus's other uncle. Because in many ways, Krampus reflects this part of the psyche that is the blend of the wild and the civilization. In Jungian terms, he could be considered the wild man, but he's definitely symbolic of the dangers of the natural world, in particular, especially with his association with Christmas. It's linked to the dangers of winter. Because winter was and still is a very trying time for many people. And we can get into that more later if you want. But it's taken me this long to actually get to a description of Krampus, so I'm going to try to keep on track here. So Krampus would come with his chains and his bells, and we don't I haven't really read accounts of Krampus being verbal, like of Krampus actually being able to speak, other than to ask children, can you recite your prayers? And if the answer is no, you get whacked with a birch switch. Or the threat is to be thrown into his sack and either taken to hell or taken to Spain. If you're taken to Spain, that's because Germany and Austria were, I believe, heavily Protestant at the time, and so they found it abhorrent, the idea of spending Christmas among Catholics. I don't know. Christmas in Spain sounds like a little warmer, maybe nicer than Christmas in the Alpine regions. So maybe those children who were abducted by Krampus just were living the high life. But that was the threat that Krampus posed. December 5th through 6th are the best day to stay in hotels in European countries where they celebrate St. Nicholas Day, because they ask you to leave your shoes outside your room so Nicholas can leave you some sweets. Oh, that's so cool. I'm going to have to keep that in mind if I'm ever traveling abroad in December. That's really neat. Yeah, so that's definitely a difference between a lot of European Christmas customs and American ones. We have the traditional leave your stocking by the fire, and a lot of the traditions in more Northern Europe, you leave out your shoes, or sometimes you hang something on the foot of your bed. There's a lot of different gift givers as well, by the way, not just Sinterklaas or St. Nicholas. In Italy, there's La Befana, who is a witch, and she's the one who comes and brings gifts to children. She has a fascinating backstory. And there's other than Krampus and his counterparts, there are also a lot of other dark figures who come calling at Christmas time. And I cover a lot of those in the course Yuletide, Keeping Old Christmas. Again, I've pinned the link to the top, but then there's another link I shared just if you wanted to read a little bit more about what the course is, because it's not just information like this. It's also traditional recipes, crafting ideas, and a community. We've got a Discord, and we've got a private Facebook group as well. And I'm obsessed with Christmas, and I love doing Christmassy things. So everyone who registers for the course has the option of having me send them a holiday card. So I mentioned that Krampus would accompany St. Nicholas, as the name suggests. St. Nicholas is a Christian figure. But it's fascinating that when I started to delve into research about St. Nicholas himself, I discovered that the trail runs cold very quickly. There actually is not a huge amount of evidence, other than the name, to support that the figure we now know as Santa Claus was wholly inspired by St. Nicholas. In fact, my argument, and yes, this is conjecture, is that there's just as much of Santa Claus in Krampus as there is in St. Nicholas. So these figures morph and change over time, and often what survives is some sort of amalgamation of a lot of different cultural influences. So Krampus is probably an example of a figure who is pre-Christian or pagan. Pagan is a large umbrella term. It literally just means non-Christian. It is therefore very Christocentric. But most Western cultures these days are Christocentric inherently. Maybe I shouldn't say inherently, but they are they have been Christianized. And so, but at some point before that, they had different beliefs. And so we broadly speak of those beliefs before Christian conversion as pagan. Another way to look at those beliefs is indigenous European beliefs, because Christians brought, by and large, Christians, and to some extent the Romans, I don't want to get too into the reads here, but they by and large brought writing to most of indigenous European peoples. And so for the first time that we have any glimpse into what their culture was like, or their spiritual practices or religions or their hierarchical structures or their societies, were always through the eyes of outsiders, people who were not actually part of that community. And especially when it comes to the Romans, and often with missionaries as well, they had an agenda. They were not being objective. They weren't writing down exactly what they saw for National Geographic or something. They had motivations to, because who's going to be reading these documents? Higher ups in the church, or emperors and other people of influence back in Rome. So they always had a slant to try to convince someone of something, or often, especially in the case of the Romans, to justify their own deeds or indeed misdeeds by painting the other group of people as barbarians and indeed othering them. So it is possible that Krampus originated from some sort of deity or supernatural figure that people indigenous to the Alpine regions of Germany and Austria would have known about. What happened after Christianization is that many of these, I'll call them old world, old gods, many of these figures, these pre-Christian figures, persisted. And as the church, and when I say church, please note that I'm speaking of it as a structure of power and control, especially in the context of hundreds of years ago. The church, not rather than a religious organization, because often the church has taken actions that does not align with the teachings of the Holy Book. So the church is a structure of power and control, often frowned upon people continuing these indigenous beliefs because they felt like that was a threat to monotheism, and it was a threat to their power structure. And so they would demonize the figures, the spiritual, religious, supernatural figures of the indigenous population. Once there became a more cohesive and solidified concept of what a demon is, and you know where I'm going with this, it looks like Krampus. And it's not a coincidence that demons look like Krampus and also look like figures like Pan and other hybrid animal human gods or demigods, or again supernatural figures from more indigenous European cultures. It's because if they could not eradicate them, then they needed to other them as much as possible and say they are not something you should be cavorting with. They're not something that you should be paying attention to or even celebrating because they are unholy, they're dangerous. That didn't work. Not with Krampus. Because the Krampus celebrations are still alive and well. There was a period in recent history where they were banned, and I'll get to that in a moment. I'm going to read some of these comments here. Imagine being a Spanish kid going on vacation in the northern countries and seeing a satyr-like creature who goes around scaring the other kids, saying, "Pray or I'll take you to Spain." Yeah, that would be very confusing. I haven't thought about it, but they said that Finnish Santa is a combination of Krampus and Santa, and it kind of makes sense. Even the name is directly translated as Christmas goat. Oh, cool. And in the early days, Santa was more scary than this jolly old guy here in Finland, and he brought wood sticks to bad-behaving children. Faith is beautiful. The church is an institution of capitalism at its finest, in my opinion. I don't disagree with you, Maria. That's why I feel like it's always important to give a definition of when I'm talking about the church in a context such as this, because the church, especially throughout history, has done very despicable things that Jesus would be appalled by. So that's why it's important to make that distinction. There's people who very early on saw it as an opportunity to consolidate power and influence and welded it as a weapon and a tool of colonization. So Krampus was actually so popular leading up to the 1940s that Krampusnacht celebrations were banned by the Nazis. So if you're rusty on your world history, remember that the Nazis were not just in power from 1940 to 1945. That's kind of an American point of view, because we tend to look at World War II as like when our involvement began, roughly. But the Nazi Party was exerting a lot of influence in Germany since the 30s, at least. You could argue into the 20s. I mean, there's when you study history, really, World War I didn't end. World War I just birthed World War II. So Krampus celebrations were banned for quite a while. And as soon as the Nazis were no longer in power, the celebrations came back. And right now, at the time I'm recording this, there are Krampusnacht celebrations going on not only in Germany, Austria, here in the US, and many other countries. Krampus and Krampusnacht revels are having a massive revival. And I think it's really fascinating to look at the trajectory history has taken and to see that it makes sense that it's coming back now. Oh, Francis has to go. Oh, thank you. Happy holidays to you too, Francis. Thank you for coming by. Because we are only a generation or two removed from those who lived through and survived the Second World War. Since it was such a taboo, banned custom under the Nazi regime, I could understand why people weren't immediately taking up the mantle, the furry mantle of Krampus, as it were. Oh my gosh, I just realized I forgot. I'm supposed to be doing this whole broadcast. Oops. Wearing these. These were going to be my Krampus horns. Except you can't really see them. Sorry, I forgot my costume. But you could see why it would perhaps take another generation for the practice to be resumed again, and then another generation for it to really start building up some momentum and some steam once more. So that leads us to where we are today. And I'm in a small mountain community in Northern California. Just had a massive earthquake, by the way. Thankfully, it wasn't very close to me. But earthquake with tsunami warnings, not something we get all the time. But there are Krampus events happening here in my mountain community. So some of that is due to Krampus entering pop culture. Like I said, there's a lot of B movies and C movies that involve Krampus. And of course, there's the 2015 film that I happen to love. It's a horror comedy just called Krampus. Strange that the Nazis banned Krampus while some of them officially pursued occult things. It's so weird. But I think it is part and parcel of the human condition to be a contrarian, even to your own self. Like, we all have such blind spots, and I completely agree that that just seems like such a juxtaposition. It's bizarre. But really, again, it's probably quite similar to the church as an institution, because it does, once more, come down to power and control. And if the people are celebrating this creature, this monster, and having fun, the monster's in control right then. I think it's fascinating that there's that there is a lot of connection and correlation between this very ancient human practice of pageantry and pantomime and costuming and mumming, and seeing it as a source of power. Because in very early human history, I think it was one of the biggest sources of power that there were. And I go into that in more detail in the section of Yuletide Keeping Old Christmas that's talking about the potential origins of Santa Claus. Because as someone was just saying in this chat, Desi Bielheli, I probably butchered your name, about how the original Santa Claus was much more of a dark figure. There's a strong argument to be made that, and that's why I said Krampus and Saint Nicholas, or the modern concept of Santa Claus, probably has more roots with Krampus than Saint Nicholas, because we have a long history as a human species of attempting to personify the natural forces of the world that govern our lives to this day, even though we have this artificial concept of inside and outside, and we can control our microclimates within our homes. The natural world, nature's still in charge. We just have a very thin veil of disconnect from that at the moment. But in much earlier times, there was no delusion that nature was not in control. And it's a very human impulse to then attempt to influence what you can't control, especially when your survival depends upon it. So I mentioned that winter was an incredibly challenging time for most people, and that it still is. But of course, in ages past, especially in these alpine regions, in these landscapes of Northern Europe, where the winters were long and hard, not only did they take a lot of preparation, but if something went wrong, it could go very wrong. And so most of our information does not come from when we were hunter-gatherers, which, by the way, we were hunter-gatherers for over 90%, some estimate to like 98 to 99% of our entire time existing on this planet as human beings. So all of this that I'm talking about in terms when I'm mentioning winters being difficult, I'm talking about that roughly in the last 10,000 years after the agricultural revolution, which is just like a sliver, just a teeny, teeny, tiny sliver of our existence as humans. And a lot of you are probably like, no wonder we have so many problems. This body was made to roam. It wasn't made to be sitting here right now wearing these fake deer antlers. But anyway, so when your life and your survival is dependent on your ability to not only grow food and raise livestock for food, but protect them, shepherd them, shelter your crops and your livestock through a full calendar year, through all of the threats of predators, theft from other humans, the weather, which you cannot control at all. And then you face the challenge of harvesting properly, and even more challenging, something that we don't even think about today, storing your foodstuffs, curing, storing, drying in a way that they will survive. If something goes wrong at any step in that process, you may not survive the winter. Starvation was a very real threat. So, given this mindset, you can understand why a creature like Krampus would have emerged as a personification of the dangers of winter, the dangers of the wilderness and the wild, and as a representation of this bridge between civilization and really an agricultural lifestyle, and perhaps what had been, perhaps some sort of distant echo of not only a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, but also that of the animals and of the non-human animals of the wilderness. And just acknowledging that fear, acknowledging how little control and influence we actually have over those things, is actually taking back control. If you name it, you know it. So, in so many ways, having a creature like Krampus come parading into your village was therapeutic because there he is. That's a representation of all these things that I'm afraid of. And he's going to come through and he's going to scare us. And he might whack some of us with his sticks and he's going to make this roaring, wild sound and do his thing and he's going to go. And I've seen it and I've confronted it. And I've so many ways like let out my feelings about it. It was probably really therapeutic to the people, and to this day probably is very therapeutic to the people who actually don a Krampus outfit. We have some more comments. Yeah, people were weirdly obsessed with mythological stuff. Okay, that's a lot of time. It is, right? My anxiety-induced self would not have made it back then. I would have said back in day one, leaving everything and going on vacation. Winter still feels very different in big cities versus rural countryside. So it's kind of like exposure therapy, I suppose. Yeah, because if someone's donning a costume and parading as a character like Krampus, a being like Krampus, that act in its nature is exerting some level of control because you're putting parameters, like parentheses on it, right? It's becoming contained. It's becoming something you can see, you can touch, you can hear. It's becoming something that's no longer the nebulous what if. The unseen forces of the wind, the unknowable source of the snowstorm that could come. And so that's what we mean by personification. And I think it's a way to take a lot of these really terrifying unknowns and put them in a compact package that you can interact with. And people to this day, people have always been people. You know, we have this very sanitized view of the past, largely because the writings that we have, the surviving recordings that we have, people are speaking or behaving or writing in a very stilted manner, and a lot of that was the convention of conduct at the time, but they were still just the same as us. So it's I find it difficult to let that in sometimes because I don't see that represented in the same way. But it's true. That's the truth. And so everyone's always had anxiety over the unknown. Like that's part of the human condition. And that's part of what's made us survive, by the way. This is another tangent I won't go too far down. But that is why we've survived and been successful as a species. One of the reasons, not the only reason, one of the reasons is we have a very large fear response compared to potentially some other hominid species that didn't survive, because it's in our best interest to hear a rustle in the grass and jump into the tree to safety than to be like, it was probably just the wind. Couldn't have been a saber-toothed tiger. So we have sort of a, I won't say overactive, but we have a strong fear response. And that's really tough for us to navigate in today's world. I'm sure it was tough to navigate back then too. But we've lost touch with a lot of our customs, like Krampus, that do give a face to these fears, that give a face to these demons. And we've lost a lot of ritual. Having that cleansing, empowering moment of ritual not only builds community and reminds you that like you're not alone. Everyone was just went through this terrifying experience of Krampus coming through. Not only does it solidify those bonds, but it's not necessarily survival of the fittest all the time with social organisms. It's survival of the friendliest. And humans are actually, we criticize ourselves a lot. We're actually quite friendly as a species. We form community. We need each other to survive. So if you had a field harvest, if you did store and salt your meat properly, if some of these disasters in the wintertime happened, you needed to rely upon your community and having those strong social bonds through having these shared, again, dare I say, therapeutic rituals of personifying the danger and the scary and going through it together and sort of releasing it and being cleansed of it. was an incredibly powerful force that I think we don't talk about often enough today, and we certainly don't have avenues of release like that anymore. Not where I live. It's not culturally condoned, which is a real bummer. You kind of put barriers on what scares you. You say, okay, he'll come and he'll do this and that and no more. He's scary, but not like the real thing. Yeah, exactly. That's the idea I'm trying to get across here. In that way, it's healing, and that really is the origin of a lot of ritual and indeed religious practice in general. Is maybe if I do this and that, if I do these things, maybe XYZ will happen. Maybe if I leave out cookies and milk and a carrot for the reindeer of this visiting supernatural figure we now call Santa Claus, maybe you'll bring me some presents. Maybe you'll get a blessing for the rest of the year. And I've heard a lot of anthropologists postulate that it's highly possible that in prehistory, our ancestors worried that if they did not conduct these rituals, maybe winter would not end. If they didn't do these things, I mean, it's a very humanocentric, obviously, like, point of view, but we're humans, like, that is going to be our point of view. This idea that maybe the sun won't be reborn. Maybe the sun won't begin to, its presence won't begin to wax again and bring the spring. So it's our responsibility to keep the world turning. It's our responsibility to keep the sun happy, to appease whatever forces of nature we can appease. And really, that's, once again, it all comes back to the same thing, personifying these forces of nature that you really can't see or touch or interact with much in a way that you can see and touch and interact with them. I thought it was fascinating. Nobody knows the exact origin of the name Krampus, but in Bavarian, Bavaria is a region of Germany, there's a word Krampen, Krampn, which means dead. And there, in German, is the word Kramp, Krmp, which means claw. So I find it really fascinating that both of those potential etymologies of or contributing potentially to the word Krampus, the identity of Krampus, have these harrowing aspects to them. When I think about us as a species sometimes, it amazes me that we are so freaking friendly. I mean, we saw wolves, these apex predators, and said, "Aw, fluffy friend." I know, right? I'm a big dog lover, so I love that stuff. I would argue those probably the dogs or the wolves that maybe started it, I think. And there's actually a line of thinking that says it was women. It was human women who started interacting with them and caretaking them, because the earliest archaeological remains we have of deceased, I don't know what to call them, like wolves on the path to becoming dogs, they believe were graves that women made for them, because humans in general have strong nurturing and caretaking tendencies. Again, that's part of us being communal individuals. But I don't know. I like that. I like that idea. That and it tracks with like what I observe in a lot of ways. That yeah, it does make sense that a woman would see a puppy or something and be like, "Oh, you don't have a mommy? Come here, I'll be your mommy," and aid that domestication process. Isn't it fascinating? There's so many fascinating tangents. Well, it's already been 45 minutes. So please send me your questions in the chat, and I will see if I can help answer them. I've covered a lot of breadth, I feel like. Hopefully enough depth that you feel you've got your head wrapped around Krampus a bit, and what Krampusnacht is. There are some really fun videos that you can find from Austria and from Germany of Krampusnacht celebrations. A story came out. I should not find it funny. I find it funny. I've got a dark sense of humor about like sometimes these Krampuses or Krampi, when there's a whole gaggle of them, get rowdy with each other. And one Krampus did something that hurt another Krampus, so then the next year he got his revenge. And I'm not sure what happened, but it ended up in someone getting a broken arm or a broken leg. And that's not funny, that poor person. But it is funny to think of these Krampuses holding grudges and be like, next year I'm going to get that Krampus. So they're definitely, the celebrations are alive and well. I highly recommend the film Krampus from 2015. I have a special connection to it because I happen to be, again, I opened this by saying that some of the nonfiction I've written has been in the realm of Middle Earth. So I was in New Zealand, in Wellington, while they were filming Krampus. If you didn't know, it was filmed down in New Zealand, in Wellington, I think Stone Street Studios. And happened to be in the right place at the right time to meet the cast. And several of the artists at Weta Workshop who do props, set design, costumes, all that fun stuff, they did a lot of that for Krampus. And so while I was at work, I was like walking to the bathroom, seeing the demonic teddy bear, like just hanging out, or someone messing with it, or getting ready to do a photo shoot with it, and stuff like that. So I have a very special personal connection to that film as well. And but I just think it's a brilliant depiction of Krampus and a modern take on what if he was real and what if he came to some quaint little suburban American neighborhood. Okay, we have a question. Have you considered to write some kind of Christmas or Yule fiction story? Ooh, that's a great question. I will say I have more thought about writing a screenplay. Especially this year, I've come across some stuff that I'm like, hey, that would be really funny if there's a Christmas movie like XYZ. And then I'm like, I mean, I could write it. The industry is really going through a tough time right now. The film industry. It's almost, I mean, everyone at this point is really tired of like Spider-Man 3000 and Marvel 4000, because it's just, they just keep regurgitating the intellectual properties, the IPs that they already own. It's very difficult to get anything made at the moment, especially anything that's considered a risk because it's new. So the atmosphere is very risk averse. All the same, I would still love to try my hand at writing some Yule or Christmas stories, especially if they can weave in some Christmas folklore. I can't say I'm a big fan of the genre of folk horror, but I definitely gravitate to that. I'm not a big horror fan in general, but the films that I have enjoyed the most have been in the folk horror category because I do love that blending of this this concept of folk practices or beliefs having a hold on the modern day. Usually they're vilified. Again, most points of view are Christocentric. So they're othered and they're vilified, and they're the source of the tension or the disquiet. And but that in itself has some power. And so I like by having something from like the old ways or the old world enter into the modern times and be able to instill fear or disquiet is inherently giving it power. Even if it's being othered or vilified, it's still showing that it has power and realm of influence. So I get a rise out of that. Okay, so if I understand correctly, the modern Krampus parade has multiple people dressed as Krampuses or Krampi. But in older days, it was one dude. Why do you think they multiply? Yes, so I think they multiply because a lot of people are like, that looks so fun. And because it's no longer, because people, again, we have this veneer of civilization, we have this false sense of comfort and security in our ability to navigate the seasons and to live with the weather of the world. I think that probably several generations ago, it shifted away from being more of a ritual, more of viewing Krampus as that personification of the unknown and of the darker forces of winter in the natural landscape that I was extrapolating upon earlier, and more into let's cut loose. Like, as societies, like I said, we have so few rituals anymore, and it's definitely not ones that are a pressure release valve. Halloween is the best example I can think of. And I think, like, I've never attended, but Mardi Gras, from what I hear, is another good example. Carnival like atmospheres. Most of our holidays used to be like that. Most of them were what anthropologists and sociologists call these pressure release valves for society. You can dress up as someone else. You get to take a vacation from yourself. You get to be someone else. You get to do something else. You get to leave your identity at the door and just exist and experience life in your community in a way other than who you are in your day-to-day life, or what your role is, or what expectations are upon you. This was especially predominant at Christmas, largely inspired by Roman Saturnalia, in which everything was topsy-turvy, and for like 2 weeks the lower echelons of society were elevated, and like slaves could talk back to their masters and there'd be allegedly no repercussions. At least in that period. I'm really suspicious that, like, if you got real sassy in the ancient Roman times, that they might be like, all right, when your 2 weeks is up, you're going to pay for that. That carried over into medieval times in Europe, especially in England, where they would have someone be crowned like the king of Lord of Misrule for the Christmas time period, which was also a much longer time period than what we celebrate today, even longer probably than the 12 days of Christmas. And again, you can learn more about that in my course, Yuletide, Keeping Old Christmas. You're painting, you're writing, so you could write a holiday picture book. I don't feel confident enough in my artistic skills to do a holiday picture book, but that's really sweet. That's always been something a goal I wanted to work toward. It's just about forcing myself to actually put in the hours to get to a point with my artwork where I feel like I can do that. And thank you for saying that, because maybe that's what I need. Maybe I need that little kick in the pants and that little push of someone being like, hey, if you make it, I'll enjoy it. Because isn't that what we all need at the end of the day? I still love Marvel movies, not gonna lie. I'm ride or die MCU, so I don't want them to stop. Sorry, I wasn't trying to like throw Marvel or Spider-Man under the bus, but in fact, in a fascinating way, you can view them as like a lot of our more modern folktales or forms of mythology, because they're characters that a lot of us universally know. They're supernatural, and we want to hear more stories about them. I mean, Achilles was probably talked about for 1,000 years or something in the area that's now Greece, in that part of the Mediterranean. We have like a pottery shard with the only discernible word on it is the name Achilles, from way before the Iliad was ever recorded. So and in that way, I see the appeal of continuing to tell stories in these spaces. But from the point of view of someone who I've got like 12 screenplays, several of which have won national awards. So from the point of view of someone who's like, can I try? Can I at least have the opportunity to be told no? It's very stagnant. And it's like everywhere else right now. Everything's tightening their purse strings. The writer's strike was great. All the strikes that we witnessed last summer were great for the actual creators and the talent. But Hollywood's response has been like, oh, it's too expensive to make anything now. I mean, we have to pay our CEOs billions of dollars. So I'm actually not well versed in it enough to know exactly where the money's going, but it's hard not to view it that way when you see the payouts that a lot of these people are going, and then they're being like, oh, well, you wanted to actually be fairly compensated for your work that I'm making millions off of. That's going to be hard for me. And so it's become quite cutthroat. And I'm hoping that this is just a moment. This is just a moment as things continue to shift because of streaming and because of other platforms entering the scene. But anyway, that's a separate discussion. Other than to say, support Krampus films, support some of these more independent points of view that you see in cinema. Has the description of Krampus always stayed the same, or has it changed over the years? That's a really good question. From what I can tell, it's always been a horned, hairy, probably always had, bipedal, so on two legs, hooved, and the red tongue. The big red tongue is a big tell. I didn't really get into Belsnickel, but Belsnickel is like more or less the more sanitized and version of Krampus, who is often considered more palatable from a Christian point of view because he's not quite as intimidating and monstrous and heathen looking. But he's like he's like Krampus's tidy little brother. And so sometimes he shows up. Nechtwurprecht's another one. Nechtwurprecht is like the most benevolent of all of these dark shadows of Santa Claus. He doesn't do much. He more or less is just there to be like, I could hit you with a stick. Probably won't, but I could. I have a friend from Germany who grew up with Nechtwurprecht, and he said he never saw Ruprecht pulling out a switch to strike anyone, but they were always there as like a, you know what I'm here for. Again, this fear of like the old ways in the old world, casting a shadow over the modern is fascinating. It was such a great time when Netflix, in its early streaming days, made a lot of small budget movies. It was finally some diversity of storytelling was happening. It was so needed and welcomed. And that's how we end up with so many ether robots or live action remakes, or either robots or live action remakes of animated films, which is sad that cinema won't take risk. I know, it's really sad. And that's something I've had to come up against. Sorry, this is totally an aside from Krampus. I mentioned some of my screenplays have won national awards and gotten a lot of attention from people in power, and I was told again and again, ad nauseum, that because they were about female protagonists and were not based on previously successful source material, so Lara Croft Tomb Raider, Hunger Games books, comic book, Queen Elizabeth, who everyone knows about and would be fascinated by, those are all considered previously successful source material. I wasn't writing about that. Some of it was completely original. I was told that was far, 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 far too risky. So it's just so frustrating. Oh, we still talk about Achilles over here. I'm a Hellenic, though me and my friends can't help but make fun of him sometimes because he was, oh my goodness, yes. Achilles was such a drama queen. Such a drama queen. And that's a fascinating discussion to have. Why were the Greeks so fascinated by someone who was so capricious and actually embodied so many of the qualities that we don't really see as heroic? I love that type of discussion. So I'm sure you'll get your moment to express your creativity at some point. Oh, thank you, Maria. It'll happen. It's just taken a while. These things come in waves. These things come in seasons. And you know what? This has been really rewarding for me, being able to share my knowledge with folks like you, everyone who's watching this. If you're not watching it live, perhaps you're watching it after this recording finished. Thank you so much for being here, because this does give me a lot. And to me, this feels like creative expression, because I'm taking so much of what I've learned and I'm trying to express it eloquently and creatively, and hopefully very accessibly. So thank you all so much for joining, and thank you for being here. Again, if this has been fun, please check out Yuletide Keeping Old Christmas. There's a whole landing page where you can read more about it. But it's only $75 right now, and it covers 3 months worth of information. So this is the lowest I've ever offered it at. And I'm doing it because I want to make it more accessible to folks like you. So thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your time. And I hope you have a wonderful Krampusnacht. And of course, a very happy holiday and wintertide. Thank you guys. I'll see you all again next time. Bye.